Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a challenge that, well, it keeps policymakers up at night in some of the world's biggest economies.
Hmm.
How do you help regions that are just sort of stuck? Maybe they've been lagging economically for ages, or maybe they've been slammed recently by things like automation, globalization, or, the big shift to greener industries.
It's a really tough problem. And it's one faced by both the European Union and the United States, which is interesting.
Yeah, and what's fascinating, based on the sources you've brought us today, is that while the problem is shared, the actual approaches, the strategies they use, they seem, well, pretty different.
Couldn't be more different, really.
Hmm.
These sources, they really lay bare these contrasting ways of thinking about it.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to figure out what these strategies actually are, how they stack up, what the sources say about whether they, work,
Hmm.
and ultimately, what crucial lessons we can pull out for anyone thinking about economic development. And underpinning a lot of this, you're going to hear us talking about place-based policy.
Right. Place-based, it sounds maybe a little obvious, but it's a key concept here.
Yeah.
Simply put, place-based policies aren't just general economic ideas applied everywhere.
Okay.
They are very specific strategies, laser-focused on particular geographic areas, those regions that are either, chronically trailing the rest of the country or have just taken a big economic hit recently.
So the goal isn't necessarily a rising tide lifting all boats nationally. It's more like, how do we lift the specific boat that's kind of stuck on the sandbar?
Exactly.
And what's the big idea? What are they trying to achieve in these targeted spots?
Well, it really boils down to improving economic and social outcomes within that place. That means everything from creating jobs locally,
Mhm.
upgrading essential infrastructure,
Yeah.
boosting innovation in that regional economy, to making sure people have better opportunities right where they live. It's about trying to foster prosperity from the ground up in a specific location.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, the sources spend a good chunk of time contrasting the EU and U.S. methods for doing this. Let's start across the Atlantic. The EU's approach, as you mentioned, it's painted as incredibly comprehensive.
It really is. The EU operates under its cohesion policy framework, and that represents well, a very comprehensive long-term commitment.
Yeah.
Crucially, it's centrally coordinated at the EU level, even though the actual doing involves member states.
And the money involved.
Oh, it's serious money. The sources put the annual budget somewhere around, 60 to $70 billion just dedicated to this.
Wow, 60, $70 billion a year just on trying to balance regional economies.
Yeah.
That really tells you how central this is to the whole EU project.
Absolutely.
And this isn't some new thing they just thought up, is it?
Not at all. The philosophy, it goes right back to the very beginnings of what we now call the EU. It's rooted in the Treaty of Rome. From the outset, there was this recognition that, to build a successful union, you had to actively work towards regional equity and reduce those really stark differences between areas. It's like fundamental to their identity.
So how does that history and that massive budget translate into action today? What are the actual tools the EU uses within this framework?
Well, the sources highlight four main funds that are kind of the engines of this policy.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF.
VRDF, right?
This one's focused on things like promoting innovation, helping out small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs,
Mm-hmm.
driving digitalization, and investing in energy efficiency projects. It's very much about modernizing those regional economies.
Got it. So tech, business support, green stuff. What about the people side of things?
Yeah, that's where the European Social Fund, the ESF, comes in. It focuses on employment, helping workers adapt or maybe move for jobs, supporting education and training,
Okay.
and promoting social inclusion. It's really about investing in the human capital within those specific regions.
And there were two others.
Right, the Cohesion Fund, that one's specifically aimed at infrastructure and environmental projects, but it's targeted towards the less developed member states,
Sure.
helping them catch up on really fundamental facilities.
Okay.
And then there's a newer one, very timely, the Just Transition Fund. This was created precisely to support regions that are facing the biggest hurdles in the shift away from fossil fuels.
Like coal regions, maybe?
Exactly. Places that might lose coal mines or heavy industry jobs as we move to a greener economy. It helps them manage that transition.
So a very structured system,
Mhm.
specific pots of money for different clear goals, all coordinated from the center. Now let's contrast that with the picture the sources paint of the U.S. approach. It sounds almost the opposite, fragmented, short term.
It really is a different beast. In the U.S., these place-based efforts, they tend to be more scattered, often shorter-term initiatives, rather than one big cohesive strategy. They're frequently driven more by, say, local needs, state priorities, or maybe specific federal grant programs that pop up, rather than a single, unified national plan.
So less like an orchestra following one conductor,
Yeah.
and maybe more like several different bands playing in the same park, sometimes maybe not even in sync.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. You see programs emerge like enterprise zones offering tax breaks or specific grants for infrastructure upgrades in just one city, or maybe incentives to attract a big company to a struggling county.
Okay.
The upside, I suppose, is they can be highly adaptive. They can respond quickly to very specific, immediate local challenges.
That responsiveness sounds good on the surface, but what's the limitation? What do the sources point out as the downside of that kind of model?
Well, the big challenge is continuity, stability,
Yeah.
because these initiatives are often tied to specific funding cycles or political terms, or maybe just the priorities of the current local leadership.
Right.
They can lack strategic staying power. A successful program might get cut or changed dramatically when a new administration comes in, whether that's local, state, or federal.
So it's hard to build long-term momentum.
Exactly. That can make it really tough to achieve lasting impact.
Okay, so we have the EU, long-term, centrally directed, multiple funds, big budget, and the U.S., more fragmented, adaptable, maybe less stable, driven by various initiatives. When you look at the results described in the sources, how did these compare? Have either of them actually worked in lifting places up?
Well, the sources do highlight successes on both sides, which is encouraging. For the EU, that cohesion policy is often credited with driving significant economic convergence.
Convergence, meaning.
Meaning catching up. We've seen formerly less developed regions, particularly in Eastern Europe after they joined the EU, achieve really rapid growth and move much closer to the EU average in terms of income and prosperity.
Wow.
So that targeted, sustained investment seems to have really paid off there.
That's a powerful example. And in the U.S., any white spots mentioned?
Yeah, the sources point to regions in the American South as benefiting from sustained federal attention over decades, actually. Policies aimed at attracting industry, building infrastructure, they've contributed to substantial economic growth and diversification in many parts of the South, helping them move away from maybe older agricultural or manufacturing bases.
So policy can move the needle. That's good to hear. But the critique also raises this really important point. Some regions just seem stubbornly resistant to change, no matter the policy, no matter the investment.
Right.
Places like southern Italy in the EU or maybe Appalachia in the U.S. Why do these areas continue to struggle, even after decades of effort and, presumably, lots of money?
Yeah, this is where the sources really dig into the deeper, maybe more difficult issues. They emphasize that in these places that are persistently struggling, the challenge isn't just a lack of cash. Just throwing money at the problem isn't enough because the issues are more deeply rooted. We're talking about structural things, governance issues, institutional factors that act as fundamental barriers.
Okay. Let's unpack those barriers then. What specifically do the sources identify as those deeper problems that stop regions catching up?
Well, one critical factor they mention is institutional quality.
Institutional quality.
What does that mean exactly?
It's about how well governed a region is, how transparent are its processes, how strong and effective are its local institutions, things like regional development agencies, schools, local government itself.
Right.
Where institutions are weak or maybe corrupt or just plain inefficient, even significant investment can be absorbed really poorly. The money just doesn't translate into effective projects or sustainable change. It gets wasted.
So it's not just having the funds, but having the local capacity and, frankly, the integrity to use them well. What else? There's also the challenge of complexity and coordination.
Yeah.
And this is a problem you see in both systems, though maybe it's more obvious in the U.S. with its fragmentation.
How so?
Well, just navigating the layers of bureaucracy, getting different government agencies, federal, state, local, plus various local stakeholders like businesses and community groups to actually work together smoothly. It can be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Poor coordination means efforts might be duplicated, or even worse, they might actually work against each other, undermine each other.
That sounds like a recipe for inefficiency, definitely. And what was the final deeper factor mentioned?
That's economic geography. And it's crucial. Policies have to be tailored to the fundamental economic reality of a place.
What do you mean by economic reality?
Is it rural or urban? Does it have good access to major markets? What are its natural advantages or disadvantages? The sources talk about the importance of understanding things like urbanization trends or where industries naturally tend to cluster what economists call agglomeration effects.
Hmm.
Policies need to align with these underlying realities. A generic, one-size-fits-all policy applied everywhere just won't work if it doesn't fit the specific local conditions and opportunities.
That makes perfect sense. You can't just copy-paste solutions from one place to another. The
Yeah,
strategy really has to be specific to the place itself.
exactly.
Okay, looking ahead now. One of the biggest economic shifts happening right now is the green transition. How are these different place-based policy systems approaching the challenge of helping regions adapt away from fossil fuels?
Well, the EU, kind of true to its nature, has been quite proactive here.
Hmm.
As we mentioned with the funds, they specifically created instruments like that Just Transition Fund.
Right.
This is a deliberate policy response. It's designed to anticipate and soften the economic shock in regions most dependent on high-carbon industries. It provides funding for things like retraining workers, developing new businesses, building new infrastructure. It's kind of baked into their long-term planning.
So they saw it coming and built a specific policy structure for it. And the U.S.
In the U.S., particularly under the current administration, there's been a significant scaling up of initiatives aimed at supporting clean energy development and related job creation in affected areas. There are federal programs, incentives targeting these regions.
So action is happening there, too.
Yes, but the sources note that these efforts, while substantial now, could be more vulnerable to future political shifts
Yeah.
compared to the EU's more entrenched framework. That continuity challenge we talked about earlier, it potentially remains.
Right, that stability difference again. Any other future trends the sources highlight for EU place-based policy? Where are they heading?
Yeah, the sources point to an increasing focus on linking the cohesion policy more closely with broader innovation goals. It's not just about helping regions catch up anymore, but about helping them really thrive in the future economy.
How so?
This means actively trying to foster high-tech clusters in diverse parts of the EU, spreading innovation beyond just the traditional hubs, and enhancing overall competitiveness on a global stage.
Interesting. So moving from just cohesion or catching up to cohesion and innovation, building future strengths.
Precisely.
This comparison has been really illuminating. Let's zoom out now and try to distill the absolute key policy takeaways from the sources. If you're a policymaker or maybe just interested in what makes regional development work, what are the big lessons that leap out from comparing these two very different systems?
Okay, the sources seem to offer 4 really critical lessons. First, lesson number 1, loud and clear. You need the money, yes, but it has to be sustained and stable funding. And it needs to be coupled with clear long-term strategic objectives.
Right.
The EU model, despite any flaws, really demonstrates the power of that consistency over decades.
Consistency counts. Got it. What's the second big takeaway?
Second, and this maybe explains those persistently struggling regions we talked about, is the absolute need for effective governance and robust local institutional frameworks.
Ah, that institutional quality point again.
Exactly. Investments are just far more likely to succeed where there's transparency, local capacity, and strong local leadership to actually manage and implement projects effectively.
Yep.
Without that, money gets lost.
So strong local foundations are basically non-negotiable. Okay, the third lesson.
Context is king. Generic policy solutions just don't cut it. Strategies have to be highly specific and tailored to the local economic geography, respecting the unique conditions, the opportunities, the challenges of each individual region.
Know the place you're trying to help deeply.
You got it. You really have to tailor it.
Tailor. Okay, and the final key lesson from the sources.
Comprehensive, integrated approaches seem to work best. Trying to fix just one thing, say only infrastructure or only job training in isolation, is less effective. Policies that simultaneously address multiple dimensions, economic, social, environmental, institutional, tend to show superior results compared to just isolated interventions. It's about seeing the whole regional system.
Sustained funding, strong local governance, tailored strategies, and integrated approaches. Those 4 seem like really powerful, hard-won lessons from looking at these very different systems that are trying to solve the same fundamental problem.
They really do. I think this deep dive into the sources provides some valuable insights for anyone trying to understand why some places thrive while others seem to struggle, and what policy can realistically achieve.
Yeah.
Understanding these contrasting frameworks helps highlight both the potential for effective action, but also maybe the deep-seated obstacles that policy alone might struggle to overcome.
It certainly underscores that point. We've seen that targeted policies can drive success, absolutely, but also that these deeply ingrained issues can make change incredibly difficult, even with significant investment and very different approaches, like we've discussed. So, given the persistence of these challenges in certain regions, despite everything, what does this suggest about the limits of policy by itself? And maybe what other factors, perhaps less discussed factors, might be absolutely crucial for triggering truly transformative change in these lagging regions? Something for you to ponder.